Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I am genuinely excited about today because we are stepping away from chips and CapEx and into something that touches every single human being eventually, which is medicine.
That's a perfect framing because the story I want to unpack today is one of those quiet milestones that I think people will look back on in a few years as a real turning point.
You're talking about the Quotient Sciences announcement, and I have been following this one closely because it is the first reported case of an artificial intelligence-designed drug formulation actually entering a human clinical trial.
Right, so let's set the table for everyone listening because there is a really important distinction buried in this story that I think a lot of headlines are blurring together and getting completely wrong.
Absolutely, and this is the part I want everyone to really sit with because there are two very different things that people lump under the phrase AI-designed drug, and they are not the same.
So walk me through that distinction because when I first read the news, my brain immediately jumped to the idea of an AI inventing a brand new molecule from scratch in a lab somewhere.
That is exactly the confusion, and it is worth slowing down for. The first category is the molecule itself, the active ingredient, the actual chemical compound that goes in and does the therapeutic work in your body. The second category, which is what Quotient Sciences is doing here, is the formulation, which is everything about how that drug is actually delivered. The tablet, the coating, the way it dissolves and gets absorbed.
Okay, that is a genuinely useful clarification because I think most people, myself included, never even think about formulation as a hard scientific problem that requires its own deep expertise and years of trial and error.
And that is the tragedy of formulation, honestly, because it is invisible when it works and catastrophic when it fails. A brilliant molecule that cannot be absorbed properly by the body is essentially a useless molecule.
So what exactly did Quotient Sciences announce? And who is the partner doing the actual machine learning heavy lifting? Because I understand there's a second company involved in the technical core of this whole effort.
Yes, so Quotient Sciences initiated this phase 1 study at their facility in the United Kingdom. And crucially, they did it only after getting approval from the MHRA, which is Britain's medicines and healthcare regulator. The machine learning engine behind the formulation work comes from a company called Intrepid Labs, and their algorithm rapidly explores a huge space of possible formulation options and makes far more data-informed decisions throughout.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because whenever I hear the phrase rapidly explores a huge space, I get a little skeptical that we are just dressing up ordinary computation in fancy language.
That is a fair challenge, and I would push back gently because formulation development has traditionally been an incredibly slow, almost artisanal process where scientists test combinations one batch at a time over many long months. What the AI does is intelligently navigate that enormous combinatorial space, predicting which formulations are most likely to be stable and absorbable. So the lab only physically tests the most promising candidates instead of everything.
So it is less about the computer having some magical insight and more about it being a brilliant prioritization engine that tells the human scientists where to actually spend their limited and very expensive laboratory time.
Exactly. And that reframing matters enormously because the real bottleneck in pharma has never purely been a shortage of ideas. It has been the brutal cost and time of physically testing everything in the real world.
Now, I want to zoom out from this single trial because I get the sense that this Quotient story is really just one visible data point in a much larger wave that is building across the entire industry.
It absolutely is, and the numbers here genuinely surprised me when I dug into them. As of the start of 2026, there are now more than 200 AI-originated drug programs in active clinical development.
More than 200 is a striking figure. But I always want to know how that breaks down across the stages, because being in a phase 1 trial is very different from being anywhere close to approval.
Great question, and the breakdown roughly looks like 94 programs sitting in phase 1, around 56 in phase 2, and about 15 in the much later and far more demanding phase 3 trials.
That is a classic funnel shape, which actually reassures me a little, because it suggests these are real programs progressing through real regulatory stages rather than just a giant pile of early-stage science experiments.
And here's the statistic that everyone is talking about, the one that makes investors lean forward in their chairs. AI-designed candidates are reportedly hitting around a 90% success rate in phase 1 safety trials.
Okay, 90% immediately sets off my skeptic alarm again, because that number sounds almost too good to be true. And in this industry, numbers that sound too good usually have a catch hiding somewhere underneath them.
You are right to be suspicious, and I want to be really honest with our listeners about this. Phase 1 trials mainly test whether a drug is safe in healthy volunteers, not whether it actually treats anything. So a high Phase 1 success rate partly reflects that safety is a lower bar than efficacy. And there is also a selection effect where companies only advance their most promising and already de-risked candidates.
That is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost in breathless headlines. And I appreciate you flagging it, because the real test for any of these drugs comes later in Phase 2 and Phase 3.
Completely agree. And Phase 2 is where dreams go to die in pharma, because that is the stage where you finally find out whether your beautifully designed molecule actually does anything useful for genuinely sick patients.
So let's talk about timelines and money, because I think that is where the AI story gets genuinely compelling. Beyond just the novelty of saying that a computer helped design a particular pill or capsule.
This is the part that I find most economically significant. Companies using AI methods are claiming roughly 12 to 18 months to go from project start to nominating an actual candidate drug for human trials.
And just to anchor that for everyone, what is the traditional timeline that we are comparing against? Because a number only means something when you can hold it up right next to the old way of doing things.
The traditional path from project start to candidate nomination has historically taken anywhere from 3 to 6 years. So we are potentially talking about compressing that early discovery phase by a factor of 3 or even more.
That kind of compression is staggering when you think about the human cost of delay, because every single year, shaved off discovery is potentially a year sooner that a patient with a terrible disease finally gets help.
And the cost side is just as dramatic. The traditional figure people cite is around $2.6 billion to bring a single approved drug all the way to market, which is genuinely almost unimaginable.
$2.6 billion per approved drug, Bashum, is the kind of number that explains why so many rare diseases simply never get treatments, because the economics just never work out for a small patient population.
Precisely. And that is why I think the AI angle here is ultimately a story about access and not just raw speed. One example reportedly screened only 78 molecules instead of the usual many thousands.
Screening 78 molecules instead of thousands is the perfect illustration of that prioritization point you made earlier, where the intelligence is really about narrowing the search rather than performing some kind of mysterious digital miracle.
Exactly. And if you can dramatically cut the number of physical experiments needed, you fundamentally change the math on which diseases are worth pursuing, including the neglected ones that Big Pharma has historically ignored for decades.
Let's give listeners a concrete example beyond formulation, because I know there is at least one AI-discovered molecule that has actually posted meaningful clinical results in real patients with a genuinely serious lung disease.
Yes, the one to know is Insilico Medicine's drug, often referred to as ISM 001-055, which targets a specific enzyme and is aimed at idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a devastating lung condition.
And what makes that particular drug such an important flag in the ground for the entire field, as opposed to just another promising compound in an already crowded and very competitive pipeline of candidate medicines?
What makes it special is that it is widely described as an end-to-end AI-discovered drug, meaning AI helped identify both the biological target and the molecule, and it has posted positive Phase 2 results.
So that one is much further along than the Quotient formulation story, which means we genuinely have AI touching every part of the pipeline now, from picking the target all the way to designing the final delivery.
That is the big picture exactly, and it is why analysts are now projecting that the first fully AI-originated drug approval could realistically arrive in the 2026 to 2027 window with decent probability.
Give me a sense of that probability and the pipeline behind it, because a projection is only as good as the number of shots on goal that are actually lined up to potentially cross the finish line.
The estimates put it at roughly a 60% probability of a first approval in that window, with something like 15 to 20 AI-involved programs expected to enter the pivotal late-stage trials during this year alone.
That raises a regulatory question for me, because regulators like the MHRA and the FDA were built around traditional evidence. So I wonder how they are adapting their frameworks to evaluate drugs and formulations born from algorithms.
That is one of the most underappreciated parts of this whole shift, because the science can race ahead. But if regulators cannot confidently assess an AI-driven process, then every one of these promising programs simply stalls at the gate.
And presumably regulators do not actually care that an algorithm was involved. They care about the same things they always have, which is whether the evidence shows the drug is genuinely safe and genuinely effective for patients.
Exactly right, and that is the healthy discipline here, because the burden of proof has not changed at all. The AI just helps you arrive at a stronger candidate faster, but it still has to survive the same rigorous trials.
I want to bring this back down to earth for a moment. Because for all the genuine excitement, we should be clear-eyed that an approval is still not the same thing as a drug that changes medical practice.
That is a really important point to land on because regulatory approval means a drug is safe and effective enough to sell. But real-world impact depends on doctors actually prescribing it and insurers genuinely agreeing to pay for it.
And there's also the contested nature of all these first claims, because I have noticed that almost every company in this space seems to be claiming some kind of first, depending on exactly how you slice the definitions.
You are absolutely right, and listeners should treat the word first with healthy skepticism. Because there is a first AI-designed molecule, a first AI-designed formulation, a first end-to-end AI drug, and so on endlessly.
So if you had to summarize for our listeners why today's Quotient Sciences news actually matters beyond the marketing language and the inevitable hype cycle, what is the real signal hiding underneath all of this noise?
The real signal is that AI is no longer just a discovery toy living in research papers. It is now threaded through the entire drug development pipeline, including the unglamorous formulation work that actually gets medicine into bodies.
That is a fantastic place to leave it, because the unglamorous parts are so often where the real revolutions quietly happen, long before the public ever notices that something fundamental has actually shifted in how an industry operates.
Couldn't agree more, and my parting thought for everyone is to watch the Phase 2 readouts over the next year, because that is where we will finally learn whether this AI-driven optimism is truly earned or overstated.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.